big companies and brands have joined the conversation on discrimination, and many of them have found themselves in situations where they are being asked to account for their own lack of diversity. Well, some activists are even asking brands to account for their own biases and the ways in which they operate in relation to society and activism as a whole. As protests for racial equality around the world continue to call on all facets of society to contribute to a just and fair society, Sechaba Motsieloa joins us now to discuss business and activism, the role that brands play, and just how they can influence change. Sechaba, very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to The Globe.
Thank you very much, sir. How are you this evening?
Well, I'm great. It's so great to have you on the show tonight, Sechaba. First of all, are brands and businesses required to lend their voices to causes like the Black Lives Matter movement campaign? I mean, some companies have come up wanting or even lacking in not really believing in the diversity as they claim.
Look, brands and consumers exist in the same space. So wherever the brands consumers are, brands will find themselves in there. What stance they take then is a question of what that brand stands for. Just because there's an issue in the market or in the community does not mean you necessarily make the brand express a voice that goes with the current narrative. If a brand has been in the community lending a hand on issues that affect that community in a positive way, it becomes easy when there's a big issue like now with the Black Lives Matter, for that brand to support the voices of the consumers in an authentic way, not in a forced way, simply because of the moment.
What does it mean then for a brand when they're faced with social media backlash for their own lack of diversity? Does this affect them in the short and long term?
Yes, it affects them both in the short and the long term. In the short term, perhaps in terms of their sales, those can be impacted. In the long term, in terms of their brand building exercise to say, what does that brand stand for? Because consumers don't forget what you did when you did it. For example, at the moment when brands prioritize to be internal, even though they are global brands in what they do, when they are prioritizing making masks for their local community, let's say in Spain versus in the global context, consumers will remember that. So when they come back and say, come and buy our brand, they'll remember that when the times were tough, you were not there to support our voice. But at the same time, as I said, the brand building exercise is a long-term exercise, but in the short term, it can affect sales if you do the wrong thing and the timing is not spot on.
And having said that, are consumers more conscious on how they pick which companies they support, especially in the age of social media and increased call for accountability?
Definitely. I think even if you were to increase your prices, for example, they will pick it up. If the conversation that you should be part of as a brand, you are not part of, consumers will know. In fact, they will hashtag you and drag you into that conversation. How you then participate in the conversation as a brand, you always need to be sensitive to the issue. You always need to have a compassionate voice, especially on something as sensitive as Black Lives Matter, something that is so dynamic and moving quickly. You always need to remember that as long as you're authentic to who you are as a brand, you are likely then to participate in those conversations in an authentic way. Consumers will bring the brand into those conversations, especially when such brands have supported other initiatives. If you take a brand that's a sporting brand that supports athletes even when they're under scrutiny, we take the brands that supported Caster Semenya, for example, when she was under scrutiny. Consumers will remember this brand remained true to who it was and who it is, and they will reward it in the long term.
And some may argue that there are people behind certain brands and certain companies, and that this is reflected in the issues that companies choose to speak on. Can one then make the argument that many brands are speaking up now because it gives them social capital?
Well, as a brand, you cannot lose the moment by not speaking, because you can actually become irrelevant. As I said, what is important is what you talk to. If it's an issue around the environment and you have been in that space, then it's fine. If it's an issue around, let's say, social issues in the community and you have been in that space, that is fine. You are right that Sometimes brands are driven by corporates in terms of the personalities that will drive an agenda, and then brand managers find themselves in a difficult space where there is a different voice that is not the brand voice that pushes an agenda. But like in any leadership position, leaders have to also guide businesses as well as brands through tough times. And that may mean allowing and asking the brand to speak to an issue that is uncomfortable, but that will stretch that brand to be able to be relevant and to make a contribution in that particular moment.
You know, Sechaba, you've been monitoring brand consumerism and brand dynamics for quite a while now. And you and I are cognizant of the fact that buying today is actually a political act. You know, purchasing a product isn't just a transaction, but it is showing your own voice. It's about having a voice, making a statement and exercising your own power, which not so many consumers are actually aware that they do have. So do you get a sense that consumers have that power to change whatever narratives that they can change as a result of their purchasing power?
I should think so. I think consumers need to reward brands that mean something to them. Brands that are aligned to their values, brands that are serving a higher purpose than just sales. We have consumers that have got so much access to data now that they can monitor conversations around the world as to how this brand behaves in South Africa versus how it behaves in Botswana or Kenya or in Spain. And if there is inconsistency, consumers, should then highlight those consistencies by choosing with their wallet and taking their money where brands are aligned to whatever serves them. Earlier, I made an example of a brand that, for example, is a global brand, but when it comes to the crunch, it focuses on just helping the mother country where it comes from and forgets the fact that it is consumed globally. Consumers will remember, and hopefully they will make it to account to say, when we needed you, beyond just what we used to use it for, you are not there. Now you're coming back. Sorry, we've got another brand that we're going to go with.
Yeah, and there's also a situation wherein consumers may find themselves in the very, I would say, uncomfortable position of having to juxtapose between brand loyalty on the one hand and brand activism on the other hand. Say, for instance, a certain brand, goes through public backlash or social media backlash, and then that particular consumer is so into this particular brand, and no other brand can work for him or her but this particular brand. So how would you advise consumers in that very difficult position to choose between their loyalty to this particular brand or their social activism?
I guess their social activism has to come first, because brands are part of whatever happens in your life. You have your community, you've got other consumers, you have the politics, you have issues that are happening in your life, and the brand needs to fit in. And if it does not fit in, unfortunately, you have to make the tough decision to say, you are no longer saving me in this particular context, and move on. That is why I was saying that brands, if they are true to their purpose and have been part of the consumer's life as well as the community, when there's an issue that they need to step up, it becomes easier and more authentic for them to support the consumer. But if that issue is way beyond the stretch of the brand, then the brand will not be able to be part of the consumer's life. And that becomes unfortunate because it has just become irrelevant in that particular context.
And for those brands which are involved in a certain storm, and they are certainly praying for their gods that this storm will pass and things will go back to normal, and customers will then come back and purchase their product and just stay with their particular brand for quite some time. So do you think that consumers will turn their backs on their social activism or brand activism in instances where a particular brand is embroiled in a storm?
Look, like any brand, storms do come and they do pass, depending on how severe that particular issue is. Consumers are usually quite forgiving if you are transparent in terms of whatever you are dealing with, and if you really understand the issue at hand, and not just juxtaposing yourself into the issue. And they can see that you have tried as a brand to understand the situation. Then consumers can be quite forgiving. It's when brands hide, brands lie, brands try to paint a good picture when the picture is bad, that consumers see that brand is taking us for granted. So I've found many brands that have had their reputation to be quite challenged, bouncing back simply because they were able to manage their reputation quite well by remaining authentic, admitting when they were wrong, and being transparent about what they are doing about it.
Let's talk about the effect of brand activism on social media engagement. To what extent does that stretch?
It has to stretch as far as the consumer wants to stretch. For example, if I'm wearing a branded item and I'm going into a space, one of my favorite T-shirts says, "Africa, your time is now." That brand owner has no control in terms of what brand means to me when I move into a particular space, but there will be images of me with that type of branding that then says something about me. If the brand owner did not intend it to mean what it meant for me, then they had better engage me and understand. We see you using our brand in contexts that perhaps we didn't expect you to. What does this brand mean? And then we can have a conversation and engagement. To the brand surprise, to find that's how brand grow, that's how they take a life of their own. And then it's just monitoring whether it's veering too far from what you intended the brand to be, or surrendering the brand to the consumers because consumers would use it quite differently. There's another brand of a retailer called Checkers. But when I grew up, it was a plastic. It had a secondary use. And that brand owner can't come back to me to say, I'm a retailer, I'm not a convenience package because of how I use the product in the end.
You know, Sechaba, it's only a few people, a very, very small chunk of the population who look at brand activism and who look at brand dynamics very objectively. And a huge chunk of the population, I suppose, don't actually care. Do you get a sense that they actually care about consumerism and brand activism?
Look, the ones that care, even though the numbers are not big, you may find that they have got platforms like social media that can amplify their messages. So it's not about the numbers; it's more about the influence that the people who care have on taking the activism to the next level. So here, I guess it's more quality of the activism and the quality of the influencers or activists themselves versus just the quantities. Because then you are able to still get the right message or the message that you want to be delivered to the most number of people. On average, yes, a normal consumer may not necessarily care, but society is not driven by people that are sitting in the center. It's driven by people that are at the front or in the periphery that are basically stretching. So I wouldn't say it makes much of a big difference. What makes a difference is the who and the influence that they have that can tell whether the activism will go for the brand.
And there are those brands who prefer to, I would call it, playing it safe and not engage themselves in any social activism or any brand activism. Would you classify those as hypocrites or hypocritical?
No, not at all. I mean, let's take a local context where you have, there is one brand that is known for its humor. It's a chicken brand. And whenever there are issues of politics, they find a way to make a commentary around the issues of the day, whether it's in Zimbabwe or in South Africa. And they sell quite a lot of chicken, spicy chicken for that matter. There are other brands in the fast-moving consumer goods that do not involve themselves with activism, but they are still able to appeal to a lot of consumers and still are quite successful. For as long as a brand is true to its essence, to what it stands for, consumers will know. So with this particular brand, whenever there is an issue that's controversial, we look forward to it taking a stance because it expresses something that as individuals we are sometimes afraid to express, but we know they will find a beautiful way of bringing a controversial thing to the fore in a way that it's then shareable. So no, they are not hypocrites if they are true to who they are as a brand.
Well, it's quite interesting that you are actually shooting down on suggestions that they are not hypocrites. I'm going to give you a hypothetical example. Say a company is embroiled in a racial storm or a racial social media war, and then another company whose for instance, whose clientele is mostly black people, and that company chooses not to call out the other company which has been involved in a racial storm. So would you say that company is involved in brand hypocrisy?
I guess like rain, it doesn't choose who it falls on. I'm always cautious to call out your competitor when they're in trouble because you don't see around corners. Trouble might be waiting for you around the corner. And when that happens, then you could be in trouble. I think with anything, sometimes you find that brands or businesses navigate very complex situations. And it's people that sit behind those brands. It's human beings. And if they have got good intentions and they're doing the best that they can, one wishes them well. Remember, behind brands, you have a full supply chain or value chain that has got employees, suppliers. And when a brand goes down, it's not just that brand that goes on, it's the whole supply chain and everybody that supports that particular brand. So you always have to have that compassion for any situation. Of course, when something has been done that is wrong by a brand or a business, you need to call it out, but you are not out to necessarily to take advantage of it as another brand or as another business to profit from it. But because it really is something that needs to be called out so that society and consumers can deal with it properly and make whatever decision they have on how they redefine their relationship with that brand or business.
Sechaba Motsieloa, brand expert, and helping us dissect and discuss the role that brands play and how they can influence change, joining us via Skype. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you, sir.
And we'll leave you there for now. The Globe will continue at the top of the hour. Thanks for watching.